Please be seated. Well, I'm having to stop a lot to drink water, and the coughing it's not a sickness, it's from yelling yesterday at the game. I was at the TCU Texas Tech game yesterday, and you have to understand how deep this rivalry goes in my family. I'm one of the few that went to TCU, but the bigger half of my family was in red and black yesterday. And we were fighting, play fighting a little bit. We're vying. It's like I felt like the disciples there, like James and John, my brother and I, trying to be at the right and left of glory there. Because I'm there, and in my purple, and Crystal has her purple on, but then I've got my dad and my brother dressed in red and black sitting next to me at the game. And we're going back and forth. It was a great back and forth. Third overtime, we finally lose. The right team actually loses there at the end. And it's my last little jab there. But third overtime, it was back and forth. The crowd was good-natured. We were going back and forth at one another. The TCU fans would come at the Tech fans, and then it would reverse as the next play. And this guy who sits next to me is a season ticket holder, and he walks in, and he's got a shirt that says Texas Tech University on it. And I was like, what gives? You were here last week. But you read the bottom, and it says, because not everybody can go to TCU. And I thought, oh, there you go. My brother and I, we jest in good fun, and after a roughing the passer call on TCU, he looks at me and goes, I thought y'all were supposed to be Christians. And I said, well, of course they take my jabs all the time. I think they look at my small school and say, oh, that's cute. They take that. But there we are, we're fighting to be at the greatness of glory in this victory, and I want to be there because it means now I've got to listen to it for another year. So this is a big thing for me. This is serious. And I'm going to listen to it all this next year, but I'm not going to forget this reading from the gospel because it's about that competing to be on the right and left of glory, competing for that moment where you stand tall as the victor, and what Jesus says about that. Because our lives are just like that. We compete. And in moments of crisis, maybe where we come under attack, the first thing we want to do is defend ourselves and say, hey, that's not how we are. It's the way we operate. When we come under attack or when we're afraid or anxious, we end up seeing those that we do life with as rivals or opponents rather than friends. And we hurt one another. That's what happens. Unfortunately, sometimes we'll hurt, we'll chastise, we'll criticize another because they simply see things differently than we do, and people are hurt. Maybe we buy into that cultural message where personal glory rests in possessions, wealth, fame, or accomplishment, and we try to get ours first. And what happens is we pull away from others who love us, and they get hurt, all because we're reaching for that position of glory or victory. This reading immediately follows Jesus' third prediction about his suffering and death. And I think that's important because of this reason. I think looking at these readings together tells me that it's less about it's less about what's going to happen in the coming days and getting them ready for that, but it's more about Jesus saying, this is what the Messiah is about. And this is what it's going to mean to be a follower of that Messiah. His message that the power and glory of this world that we continually fall into and fall to be a part of, that power and glory never ends well. Because the truth is that our missteps and our mistakes, that when we walk down that road, always keeps us in a dead end. That way of glory, that it doesn't work, or at least it certainly doesn't last, and it most definitely doesn't save. But this picture of power and glory that James and John are reaching for is that they want to sit at the right and left of that throne of glory. They think that the greatest in the end is going to be the strongest, and that the authority is going to rule as the one with the most points at the end of the game, at the end of that third overtime. But not so, right? Not so. They look right past Jesus' message about suffering and death. And they're looking ahead, thinking about what their end-zone dance is going to look like. But Jesus says, you don't understand. This picture of power, true power, is what Christ reveals and says it looks like service. It looks like humility. True power is found in being a servant to all, which goes against everything that we expect power and greatness to look like. And here's the irony of it all, that the true ones, the ones who sit at the right and left of Christ, at the end of the story are the thieves that hang on the cross. And only one says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This is that picture that confuses us, that picture that Christ gives of greatness in humility. This is the cross that is not what we expect, but this is the cross that is for us life. And the good news of that cross is that Christ knows, that Christ understands what true vulnerability is. That Christ knows the vulnerability that we experience because God has entered flesh to know us better than we know ourselves. That Christ accompanies us in those vulnerabilities, to accompany us along that road and to bring us into a life beyond that, a life beyond the powers of this world, into a kingdom of servitude and love. It brings us into a kingdom that is instead built on this foundation of love and reconciliation and mutual support for one another, which is part of the example of a picnic outside, a celebration of mutual connection and fellowship and faith to share food. And we even are fed here at this table with bread and wine, which is that sign of Christ's true presence among us right now. I was thinking about this week, I've been taken aback the last several weeks as I've been teaching confirmation. I'll tell you, we have great confirmation students. So wonderful to work with. They ask wonderful questions, and they've been asking me, I've been getting the same question in a variety of different ways. And I got it again this week. The question is, how do we know that the Bible is true? It's a great question. How do we, when we can't authenticate it, when we don't we can't validate it, how do we believe it? And at the heart of that question is the heart that each of us asks when we become under attack is, how can we know that the story of God, that the character of this God that we know and experience, how do we know that that character of God is true? The story becomes true. I saw it become true on Wednesday night when those kids, the kids club, we're talking the younger ones, were making Halloween candy care packages for our troops in Afghanistan. Called them together, and they understood that this Halloween they were going to realize that it's not about what they get, but it's about what they give back to somebody else. The story became true for them in that moment, and they got it. In that kingdom of servitude and love, it was that kingdom promise that saves us in that moment that we experience. The story became true when I saw the 4th, 5th, and 6th graders buddy up with the younger ones and suddenly take them by the hand and say, let's do this. They said, oh no, we're not going to do it that way, let's do it this way. And they're going to love this when we do that. You saw their face change, their demeanor change. It wasn't about what they were doing anymore, which when it usually is, you got to keep them busy. Suddenly, they were keeping busy because it was about helping another to give that love that they understood. How do we know that that love is true? We see it come true in that moment of service. In that moment where we experience and when we're built to share that love. When we give as Christ has given his life for many. Our story of faith becomes true in those moments when we move beyond these walls, beyond ourselves to share this promise of love. Whether we're helping with room at the inn, or whether we work at Presbyterian Night Shelter, or whether we walk with one another who's hurting and through Stephen Ministry, or whether we're part of Via de Cristo sharing the light of Christ with another, as we help out in any way as we give of our time, of our talents, Christ's love is known in those moments. The power of Christ's presence is there with us in that moment, and that promise extends and connects us with the truth that is truly beyond ourselves. So to that God of promise, be all glory, honor, and praise, now and always. Amen.